Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Preparing for SRM Installation. In this lesson, we will cover what you need to know to prepare your SRM supported storage foundation. We will review the VMware software requirements for a successful SRM installation, and we'll introduce the database requirements and walk through the setup of the SRM database. Finally, we'll review server and network requirements crucial to have in place prior to the install of SRM. And with that, let's jump right in. Shared storage and storage replication is the foundation of a successful SRM installation. Without it, you can't get very far, so it's important to get this step correct since many other steps will depend on it. First, you need to know that VMware SRM only works with supported SRM storage partners. There are over a dozen partners to choose from. To find the latest list of supported vendors, just visit VMware.com and pull up the Site Recovery Manager Storage Partner Compatibility Matrix. Wow, that's a mouthful, but it's easy to find. I'll show you real quick, actually. All right, once you've made it to VMware.com, go ahead and click on Support and Downloads. Actually, don't click on it. Hover your mouse over it and get the drop-down. Under Top Support Resources, you can see that there's a documentation link. Go ahead and click on that. This will bring up the VMware documentation webpage. What I want you to do is go to the right side under the documentation section. Scroll down and find vCenter Site Recovery Manager. Go ahead and click on that. And this will bring you to all of the documentation that you'll need for vCenter Site Recovery Manager. Release notes, admin guide. But the reason I brought you here is so that you could see the SRM Storage Partner Compatibility Matrix. You can go ahead and click on that and download it. I have already done that for us so that you can see there are quite a few storage partners that are out there. In the case of this lesson, we'll be using the HP left-hand P4000 VSA virtual SAN appliance. It's good to know that that's supported. Now that we've checked out the matrix and verified that our storage system is supported, we'll also have a good idea of what else is out there. Maybe you don't have a supported storage system or you're just getting into vSphere and SRM. You'll notice that there are plenty of choices for the protocol, whether it's NFS, iSCSI, or Fiber Channel. All these different SANs have different disk types, whether it's Fiber Channel, SAS, SATA, or even SSD, and different budgets. You can start out at, well, free, as in the case that we're doing here for an eval, on up to an enterprise class SAN. You'll notice that most of those SAN products in that matrix were traditional hardware-based SANs, but there are also some great VSA options available too. VSA, if you're not familiar, is short for Virtual SAN Appliance. And it is basically a fully functional iSCSI or NFS shared storage solution that provides a lower cost entry into the world of storage networking. In some small biz and remote office type solutions, VSAs can actually make a pretty good production solution as well, although your mileage may vary. In the case of a lab, there's probably no better way to go. It's cheap, it's easy, it's low cost, and it doesn't require a data center to cool. In the case for this training, we'll be leveraging the HP left-hand P4000 VSA. Left-hand was one of the first companies to create kind of the VSA market, and they also have a nice production hardware solution that matches their VSA. That's the same software stack, same way to manage. So if you like how this works, you might check them out for a hardware solution. EMC Solera VSA is also another way to go. Traditionally, this was a nice solution for folks wanting to practice their EMC Solera skills without needing to purchase a whole big Solera to play with, but it wasn't necessarily the easiest to set up. At least that's what I found. But in the last few weeks, Nicholas Weaver, one of the EMC V specialists, actually did some work to create what's called the Solera VSA Uber Edition. From all the reviews, it's a lot easier to set up, it's faster, it uses less resources. I really recommend you check it out because it's not just an eval version that's going to go away after about 60 days, like the left hand, you'll actually be able to keep it around indefinitely as long as it's for non-production lab use. So the left hand is a great VSA, Solera is a good VSA, but before you begin to actually implement the VSA, please take a second to actually consider the storage resources that you're going to put behind the VSA. A VSA can perform pretty well if you provide enough disk resources to handle the I/O needs of your lab environment. If you're going to be running 40 virtual machines on this one VSA, one single SATA hard drive isn't probably going to cut the mustard. You're going to want to get a couple either external hard drives to help spread out this load, or maybe look at investing in some sort of external NAS that can provide the back-end storage and spread that I/O over a couple of disks. We're now ready to move forward with the HP left-hand VSA setup for this lesson. But first, let's review what some of the steps are going to be, and so I have an idea of the order in which we're going to go. First, we're going to download the P4000 VSA from the hp.com website. Pretty straightforward, easy stuff. Then we'll prepare the VM for first use within VMware Workstation or ESX. In the case of this lesson, we're going to be using VMware Workstation. Then we'll boot up and configure the VSA from the VM's console within VMware Workstation. Then we'll finish the configuration from the HP left-hand centralized management console, which is a GUI application. Then we will verify that storage is replicating before we begin. And finally, verify that both sites' ESX servers can see the VSA presented LUNs. These are all just a good sanity check before you begin the SRM installation, because if the storage isn't working, SRM is definitely not going to work. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the demo for setting up the left-hand VSA. Okay, now that we're ready for the HP left-hand VSA setup, we first need to actually get it. So I'll show you that. What I typically do is go into Google, type in HP left-hand VSA, and hit a search. You'll notice that HP has a storage brand called StorageWorks. They've begun to kind of incorporate left-hand into that fold, so don't get freaked out. That's just the new name for HP left-hand, although you'll still see left-hand in a lot of the documentation and the download itself. So we go ahead and click on that, and I'll show you the website. There we are, HP StorageWorks P4000 Virtual SAN Appliance Software. Looks like we're in the right spot. All you need to do is basically click on the 60-day free trial button, fill out the information. If you have an HP login account, you can use that to enter your credentials and then download the demo. If you don't have an account, you'll just have to sign up for your own account or a brand new account. It's not too hard. Okay, now that we have the HP P4000 VSA downloaded, I've actually copied it into two separate folders, one for the protected site, one for the recovery site. If we take a look at this, looks just like a typical virtual machine. You got a VMX file, some virtual disks, and VRAM. Pretty straightforward. Since we haven't configured it yet, I've just copied it, and it's just at a blank state, waiting for username, IP, and all that. So to do that, let's go ahead and I can either open it here or I can actually go into VMware Workstation. I'm going to go into VMware Workstation. And we can go into File and Open. We're going to look for virtual machines. In my case, they're SRM VSAs. And the protected site is where we'll start. We'll go ahead and click Open. This is out of the box. The setup isn't quite ready for not even a production, but not even a decent lab setup. It's only got 384 meg of RAM. It's only got a 7 gig virtual disk. We need to do something here to get it ready to go. So what I like to do is go ahead and click Edit. First things first, VSA is pretty generic, and we're going to have two of these things, so I like to give it a name that's easy to recognize. In my case, it's going to be protected site VSA. Memory, I like to go ahead and set this at 1024 since I have plenty of memory in my system. It'll help it respond a little bit better. As far as networking, you might be able to use NAT in your environment. I'm going to use the bridge networking because I like it to be able to talk to other machines on the physical network. This 7 gig virtual disk is kind of an issue. So what we're going to do is add a completely separate virtual disk that will be used to store the virtual machines and provide the replication. So we want to add some hardware, in this case a hard disk. Click Next, create a new virtual disk. It is a SCSI disk, and go ahead and click Independent. We do not want this virtual disk to be snapshotted if you were ever to snapshot the virtual machine. And we want persistent so that once it's written to, it's immediately written to disk. Here is just a matter of preference, and depending on what you're going to do, you'll want to make sure you set the size appropriately. In my case, 100 gig is good enough for this lesson and good enough for what I'm going to be doing. If you have time and performance is of an issue, go ahead and click this so that all of the disk space is allocated immediately. This will speed up access to the virtual disk later and really help the lab performance work better for you. For the sake of this lesson, I'm going to leave it unchecked so that it will create quickly. I would also name this something a little bit different just so that you keep it straight. In my case, VSA data. Click Finish and OK. Now this virtual machine is ready to boot up. I'm going to go ahead and do that now so that I can finish the configuration. We'll go into full screen mode so that it's easier to see what's going on. This part can take a while. And there's nothing much to see, so we'll pause and we'll be right back. Welcome back. It looks like our left-hand VSA has finished booting up. We're now going to follow the directions at the login prompt and configure this with an IP address and set up some default user accounts. So we'll do as it says here, type in start and hit enter. Very simple screen here. Go ahead and hit enter one more time. Under general settings, we will want to add an administrator. I keep it simple for the sake of this training. You will want to make sure you write this password down because it makes it a lot easier if you can remember that later when we need to log back in to administer the VSA. Arrow down to hit none or done. That'll actually bring us back to the other menu, and then go to network TCP/IP settings and hit enter. Only one available network device here to edit, ETH0. Go ahead and arrow up and then click enter. Here we want to give our VSA its fully qualified domain name. In this case, we are calling it protected site vsa.trainsignal.local. It could be whatever though. Whatever is in your site you could use. We will also want to set a static IP address. You don't necessarily have to enter a gateway, but if your replicating SAN is on a different network, you will most definitely need to do this so that it knows how to find the other network, and that gateway should be able to take care of that. Double check that you have the correct settings and then go ahead and click OK or arrow down and hit enter. Are you sure you want to modify these settings? I'm sure. I've already checked it twice. It looks good. Let's click OK. Great, the IP address has been set. You want to make sure you document that as well. Now we're just backing our way out. While we're here, we'll go ahead and take a look at network TCP status if you want to take a look. Pretty straightforward stuff. It can show you the speed of the network, frame size. Config management. This allows you to remove it from a management group, which you'll see later, or reset to default settings if you made a boo-boo. Perhaps you set the IP at something that can't be reached by outside computers. Well, you'd want to come back in, reset it, change the IP to something that is correct, move forward. No harm, no foul. I'm going to go ahead and log out, and we will finish the rest of this in the GUI. Okay, now that our volumes are created, it's time to set up replication. To do that, we'll simply right-click on the volume we want replicated and select New Schedule to Remote Snapshot. I'll just use the default name to name the snapshot, and for description I'll say something a little more human readable. Scheduled remote snapshot of VMFS1. Want to make sure that we select a start at time, which I'm just going to take the default. In a production environment, you might choose days or whatever. We're going to actually choose every 30 minutes to do a snap. That way we can get a lot of snaps and be able to roll back quickly during our testing. Management group, this is not an application managed snapshot. We'd like to retain snapshots for a maximum of 3. I don't have much space, so I can't keep too many. If you have more space, you might keep them for longer. Volume name, this is where I'm actually going to click on New Remote Volume. And this actually kicks off a different wizard for setting up the remote volume. So add a volume to existing cluster. This is actually a remote volume, so this goes into the recovery cluster. I'll click Next. For volume name, I'll say replica of VMFS1. That can't get much more descriptive than that, so I don't worry about the description. Network RAID 0, none. So there's no redundancy on this since it's a single VSA node on the other end. After that, I'll click Close. Remote snapshots, I want to keep 3 of it as well. And I'll go ahead and click OK. As you notice there, we have a new snapshot that was created of the VMFS LUN. And there's this relationship that's been established that shows this volume replicates to this remote snapshot. Since there's no data, we're not seeing anything copied. Later on, when I add a virtual machine to this volume, you'll see that there will be data being copied between the volumes. So that's great. We have 2 volumes set up that we can present to our ESX servers. I also have them replicating to the other site. One thing we have not done yet is presented the newly made VMFS volume to the ESX server in our protected cluster. Let's go ahead and do that right now. In order to do that, we do what's called adding of a server. To do that, I clicked on servers and I went to server tasks. Now I'm saying new server. I'm just going to simply put in the name of my server. It doesn't have to match exactly, but tell you what, it's a lot easier if you can match these up with what the actual name of the server is. We're not going to use chap. All we need is the initiator node name, which I will show you how to get right now. All right, I have just basically switched the view into a remote desktop session on our protected virtual center server, and I have the VI client open, the vSphere client open. I have a single cluster and I have a single ESX server, and what I'm trying to do is get the the iSCSI name, or the IQN name, so I can put that back in to the left-hand management side to be recognized. So to do that, we go to ESX Server, Configuration tab, down to Storage Adapters. We want to then select the iSCSI software adapter. And right here you can see the iSCSI name. An easy way to grab those to go to Properties and Configure. Where it's already highlighted, I can just copy that. Once that's copied, I can roll back to the left-hand management console, paste that in there, and then go ahead and click OK. That will add the server into the console. But we're not done yet. That server needs to be assigned some volumes. To do that, I click on Tasks and Assign. And I'm going to go ahead and click the box for VMFS because I would like that to be presented to that host. And I will also present the non-replicated volume VMFS2 as well. I'll go ahead and click OK. Those have been presented. Now it's a matter of going back into that ESX host, doing a rescan of the iSCSI software adapter. So you can see I have 2 volumes now, and if you're a pro at vSphere, you'll know that we can now format those with BMFS and finish the configuration of this protected site and get some VMs on that. We'll do that, and we'll join you back in just a little bit. SRM also has some VMware software requirements that we need to be aware of in order to have a successful installation. vCenter Server and ESX Server versions must be compatible with the version of SRM that we are installing. In order to be for certain that you have a good combination, make sure to take a look at the SRM compatibility matrices on VMware.com. And there's a PDF, just like where we went to look at the supported storage solutions. There's also a PDF that'll show you how you can match up the specific version of ESX with vCenter, with SRM, and it also talks about the different operating systems that are in use. This course is using ESXi 4.0 Update 1, and for vCenter we're using vCenter 4.0, and it's running on a Windows Server 2003 R2 32-bit. And it is a supported version. It's worked pretty well for me in the past. There are others, and you can look at that matrix to find out more. Also, in order to proceed with the installation, you'll also need to download the SRM server software and have that ready to go. You'll also want to download the storage replication adapter from VMware. So that's the SRA. That's the piece that will talk from SRM. It'll allow SRM to talk to the supported storage replication, in this case, HP Left-Hand's VSA. We'll also need the SRM vSphere client plugin to be installed. That's not a separate download. That's actually included with the SRM server software, so we don't have to worry about having that in place. We'll also need to make sure that we have a vSphere installation in 2 sites. Through this lesson, you've seen that we have a protected and a recovery site. We have those in place, ready to go, so the installation shouldn't be a problem. In addition to the VMware software requirements, there's also some database requirements that you need to be aware of. SRM requires a supported database server in order to store its configuration and their storage recovery plans and whatnot. Various versions of SQL Server, Oracle, and IBM's DB2 are all supported. For the purpose of this lab, we're going to recommend that you use SQL Server 2005 Express Edition. Why? Well, it's free and it's fairly easy to download and set up. So for the purpose of your lab and following along with this lesson, it's a good way to go. Part of meeting these requirements will be taken care of in the 3 following bullet points. We're going to create a database instance for SRM. We're also going to create a database user with the correct privileges, and we're going to create a DSN for the SRM database on the SRM server. And we're going to do that on both SRM servers. In this case, the SRM server will live on the same server as the vCenter server, so we'll have to be a little bit careful, especially as we let those databases commingle. Actually, not commingle, but they'll be on the same server. With that, let's dive in to the demo of the database setup for SRM. Okay, we're now ready to show you how to set up a SQL Server database for use with VMware SRM. In the case of this lesson, we're going to use the built-in SQL Server that's included with VMware vCenter. And one thing you'll need to add to your list of software to get is actually this tool that we're using right now, which is called Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio Express. It's a free download from Microsoft.com. Just Google on it or Bing for it, and you'll find it. It's a fairly easy and straightforward installation. Next, and you get here. Once you are here, what we'll need to do is create a database instance. We'll then create a database user with the correct privileges to log in and create tables and configure the database for SRM. And then we will create a DSN that will allow the application to connect into the SQL Server. To get started, we're going to go ahead and go to Databases. And a couple options here. I'm just going to right click on the database level and say New Database. This brings up the database wizard. I'm going to use the name SRM1DB for the name of our database. And I don't have a user created yet, so we'll go back in later and create the owner for this database. So the default options are fine for now. Click through options and file groups. There's nothing that we need to worry about there. So we'll go ahead and click OK to have the database created. Great. We have a database. Next thing we need to do is create a user. And a couple levels here. You need a database user and a SQL Server user. I'm going to create the SQL Server user first. And to do that, you go to the security level, then choose logons. Once in logons, you can right click here in the white space and choose new logon from that pop-up menu. I'm going to change my authentication here to SQL Server authentication, and keeping it very simple throughout this. This could be anything you need though. I'm going to use SRM1DB as the name of my logon, and I'll give it a username and password. Don't want that to expire since this is a service account. Here at the bottom, the default database location, I will change that, however, to SRMDB. That does it here for the general tab. I'm going to go ahead and look at the server roles next. I'm going to take some liberties here since this is my own lab and I don't have high security needs. I'm not the NSA. I'm not a financial institution. I'm going to go ahead and click sysadmin for my server role. This will make this a lot easier when I'm configuring SRM later. However, in your environment, if you have higher security needs, I suggest that you refer back to the documentation from VMware to have just enough security supplied to that account. And you can work with your SQL Server or your database administration team to figure out what you would need in your environment. If you happen to be the DBA for your organization on top of the network guy, the server guy, and the VMware guy, then I highly recommend that you go to TrainSignal's website and take a look at their options for SQL training. There's some good options there, and it'll give you what you need to know to get granular with the configuration of the security. With that being said, I'll go ahead and choose sysadmin for the server role. And under the user mapping, I'm going to assign this user to the SRM1 database. I'm also going to give him the DB owner database role membership. And that's it. That's all we need to do. Logon's enabled by default. and he's permitted to connect into the database. I'll go ahead and click OK. In this instance, though, that we're talking about, we're configuring this database on the exact same server that SRM is going to be installed on. If you're configuring this for SRM server that's going to connect from a different operating system, a different remote server, you'll need to make sure that this database is configured to allow that connection. To do so, just go ahead and click on Properties at the top level of the database. And you'll want to come down to Security. Before you go anywhere, make sure that SQL Server and Windows Authentication Mode is selected. Then we'll go to Connections. And you'll want to make sure that Allow Remote Connections is checked. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to connect from a remote server. This all looks good. I'll click OK. And now that we've got the database created, we've got the SQL Server logon created, I want to make sure that the database user is also set up correctly. To do that, click on the database level and go to Security and Users. And it looks like through my creation of the SQL Server logon that I already have a database user. His default schema is DBO, and we should be good to go. He's a DB owner for database role. Go ahead and click OK. We're now ready to begin the installation, but there's one thing that we're missing right now, and that is a DSN. To create that, we'll go to Start and Administrative Tools and Data Sources. This is where we create the ODBC information necessary for SRM to connect in and contact the database, whether it's remote or whether it's local. There's already a DSN here for the Virtual Center service. We're going to create a different one to allow SRM to talk to its database. And to do that, we'll click on Add and choose a SQL Native Client, since this is a 2005 and above. Now you can give it any name that makes sense. I'm going to keep consistent and go to the drop down so I can make sure I can select from a pre-configured or a sensed database on the network. I know that this is the instance I'm looking for if I'm installing directly on the server. If you're looking for a database instance on a remote server, you'd want to make sure that you select the correct SQL Server instance. So go ahead and click Next once I've selected that. I'm not using integrated Windows login. I am going to use SQL Server authentication. And I'll put in the SQL Server logon information that we used earlier. In this next screen, you'll make sure that the default database gets changed to SRM1DB. Then click Next. And finish. That's all there is to creating a DSN. We'll go ahead and test that to make sure it worked. Test completed successfully. Great. That's all you need to do in order to create a database user and SQL Server logon, and to create the ODBC information necessary for SRM to connect into its database during the installation. An SRM installation also has some server and network requirements that we need to make sure we take care of. For SRM server requirements, they're quite similar to vCenter server. So in the case of a small environment, we actually anticipate that sharing the server with vCenter server is a good idea and works just fine for 5 hosts or less. We're looking at around 3 to 4 gig of memory in that case and 2 virtual CPUs, although I've run it effectively with a single virtual CPU. Larger environments should definitely consider using a dedicated VM for both vCenter server and the SRM server. You'll also need some network ports opened up between the various components of SRM. In between the SRM server and the vCenter server, within one site, you'll want to make sure that you have port 8095 open for SOAP communication between those two. The vCenter server plugin download also needs to be available, and there's a port for that which is 8096. That's just HTTP traffic going over that. Allows you to download the plugin to install within your vSphere client. Communication between API clients within SRM also uses a port 9007. That's the SOAP protocol talking over it. Another thing to have ready and documented and thought out is the IP networking scheme that you're going to use at the recovery site. Some folks use DHCP and they'll use leases to assign IP addresses to VMs. Some might use a pool of IP addresses that are completely separate from the IP addresses that are statically set at the protected site. And other sites will actually use what's called a stretched VLAN, which, even though the recovery site is in a remote location, it uses the exact same networking scheme as the protected site, making it quite easy from an SRM perspective. However, the complexity is actually pushed out to load balancers and firewalls and some of the issues that you might see with a stretched VLAN. DNS server is also a very key piece to have figured out for your SRM installation, because many people have a DNS server for their protected site, but the recovery site, they might think they can just use that DNS server from the protected site. Well, this is a DR product, so we want to plan for the worst, right? So it's a good idea to actually have an Active Directory / DNS server replicated to the recovery site. That way, in the event of a disaster, DNS and Active Directory are always up and running, ready to go. That's about the end of the lesson. There's some key terms, though, that we should review before we wrap up. Site Recovery Adapter is one of those key terms that was introduced in this lesson. This is also known as the SRA. This is a software provided to VMware by their storage partners to help SRM talk to the underlying storage replication software. What have we learned in today's lesson? Well, we've learned that SRM requires supported storage replication. Without it, there is no SRM functionality. We also learned that VMware vSphere requirements must be met in order to have SRM work properly. SRM works on top of two distinct VMware vSphere installations with ESX servers and storage replication underneath that. That's your solid foundation. You also need to make sure that there's a database that's dedicated to each SRM server at the protected site and the recovery site. Otherwise, you won't be able to install the SRM software effectively. We also overviewed the server network requirements that you need to think out and plan prior to doing the installation. Well, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.